Alright, we're back again with the Coleman Gokart. We hadn't touched this thing in a while, much less put it on video. But the last time we did visit this thing, it was so we can replace the torque converter assembly on our engine right there. But we're going to have to go back in this thing for a couple of reasons. One, because it hasn't ran in so long, I'm going to have to go back in the carburetor again. Hopefully I don't have to replace it. But the biggest reason is our brake system. The master cylinder, it's bad. It's really bad. Shouldn't have that kind of play in there. But because we're going to replace the master cylinder, might as well replace the caliper as well. And it looks pretty simple. Just a couple bolts, like one right there and one right there, to pull the caliper off along with the brake hose. Master cylinder should be about the same. So with all that, I'm going to go dig out the parts and start pulling crap apart. Stand by. Okay, the two 8mm bolts holding the master cylinder in place have 10mm nuts on the other side that you'll have to hold down in order to break everything free on that end. As for the pedal, to get the pedal separated from the master cylinder shaft, there's two pins right here. This first pin, the one that's at the top, you might have a harder time removing the retaining pin in its current position. So it's a lot easier to just go down there and pull that pin out. And let's see right here, if we could see this little pin right here, it's easier to get that one out. So you'll be able to pop that whole thing loose and get that separated. So then you'll be able to move the pedal around enough to get the other retaining pin out. But let me go ahead and get the master cylinder off. Those two bolts, along with the 8mm right there to get the reservoir off and get that remaining pin out. Give me a second. Okay, there's also a little spring on this bottom shaft for the pedal that you have to take into account. So try not to lose that. But with that, I could remove the pedal assembly and get this other pin out right here, put that aside, and then we can also get our setup here out of the way. Now, thing is, because all we're replacing is the master cylinder, we can remove our reservoir and obviously the brake line right there, which that looks like about either a 12mm, maybe a 13. Go ahead and find out real quick. Yep, 12mm. So on your brake line, you got a 12mm bolt to pull off. Go ahead and get that out of the way. Okay. Okay, we have our master cylinder totally separated. Still got our shaft for the brake pedal. We got our brake line separated. Make sure of your copper washers. You don't want to lose those, along with any other hardware and stuff. So now, with that, I go ahead and head to the back and get the caliper off. As stated before, there's a couple bolts holding the caliper in place. They're 10mm. I already started getting them loose because I had to put a little torque on them to break them free because they've never been off. At least not when I had this thing. So with that, probably got another 12mm holding the brake line on there. So let me go ahead and get these mounting bolts off. Of course, after you get the mounting bolts off, you're going to have to sit here and kind of fight this thing to get it free if things are locked up. Luckily, that wasn't the case here. So now I can go ahead and get my 12 on that brake line and break that free. As with the master cylinder, on your brake line, make sure you hang on to your copper washers because you're going to need them. But got our little master cylinder, caliper broken free. I'm not sure the condition of this thing. Don't really care because these things are actually pretty cheap on Amazon. They're like 15 bucks. So same thing with the master cylinder, they're like 15 bucks. So it doesn't take a whole lot to resurrect the brake system on one of these Coleman Go-Karts. So now the next thing is going to be pulling our carburetor off, which is nothing more than a couple of nuts right here that are like 10 millimeter, and getting our air cleaner off and a few linkages. So I'll go ahead and knock that out real quick. Along with the two 10 millimeter nuts right there, you also have a 10 millimeter bolt up there holding the air cleaner in place, so don't forget that. Because in the removal of the carburetor I pulled the fuel line free from the fuel tank's going to have to come off. It's just as well because there's old gas in there that needs to be drained out, which is currently happening as we speak. But in order to pull the fuel tank off, there's a couple of 10 millimeter nuts right there that have to come off on the front end. And from the way it looks, that little bolt right there also has to come off in order to pop this fuel tank all the way off. So go ahead and get that out of the way. The bolt holding the back end of this fuel tank on is actually an 8 millimeter. So you got your 10s in the front and an 8 in the back. We could go ahead and get this thing off now. Okay, we got our batch of parts removed from the machine. The carburetor still had fuel in it, so hopefully that might be good in the sense that no rust or corrosive deposits had a chance to grow inside of it. Worst case, maybe I could just get away with a good cleaning of this thing. But as for the brake system, well, we're replacing that stuff. But worst case scenario, even if I do have to replace that carburetor, they're cheap just like all the other stuff. So I'll go ahead and source our brake stuff, see what I can do about that carburetor. And if I'm confident enough that carburetor is going to work, I'll probably put that stuff back together and see if I can fire this thing up even before I do the brake stuff. So stand by. Okay, I took this carburetor apart and it had a lot of trash in there, so it required some really thorough cleaning with some chemicals and some fine implements like a piece of copper wire fine enough to get into the jet and everything. But after spraying and scraping and doing all kinds of cleaning to get every bit of particulate matter out of the different orifices and pathways in the carburetor, I think I got it clean enough that it should be able to flow gas properly. As far as the gas tank, this is a Predator gas tank that was on the engine that we put on the ATV, because the original gas tank from this engine is full of trash and it's going to need a thorough cleaning, probably putting some nuts and bolts and some old gas or something in there and swishing it around enough times to break all the garbage up from out of there. So that's going to be for another day. And in the meantime, different gas tank. All I need to do is put our air cleaner back on there, get everything buttoned up on the engine, and we can see if this pile is going to start up. So give me a minute. I got an initial tuning or tweaking done on the carburetor to allow the thing to at least run at idle with the choke mostly open. You can never really get those carburetors to act right on a full open choke, but it idles, it takes the throttle pretty good. And next thing is getting the brakes done so we can actually try to ride this thing. So let's do that. Alright, we got some new parts in. We have our master cylinder right here. Actually comes with a reservoir. Even came with a spare reservoir. There we go. Got a spare reservoir, some zip ties, extra nuts right there with the washers to lock all this garbage down. We also have our caliper right there. which also comes with the nut on there, and extra set of pads. And for some reason it came with a fuel filter. I'm guessing that they assume you're going to probably pull something loose on the engine in the process of accessing this thing. But hey, not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. I can always use an extra fuel filter, whether on this or something else. So as we already seen, couple bolts on that, couple bolts on that, and all the other little retaining pins and different garbage. Go ahead and lock this stuff back down real quick. One thing to make note of, depending on the brand or wherever you order your components from, your master cylinder might have a piston shaft that's a couple inches, 3-4 inches long, compared to your stock shaft that's hardly present, which means I'm going to have to lop off some of this threaded rod in order to get it to about the same length as what this one is, so it could mate up to the pedal properly. Where that nut is currently at is about where I'm going to need to cut it, but to be safe, I'm going to knock off a little more. So more or less I'm going to walk this nut out that way a little more, because I'd rather have to do this twice than to mess up and have that shaft be too short. So let me go ahead and lop this thing off. Okay, we lopped off the excess threaded rod, got everything situated on the master cylinder so it's bolted in place and hooked up to the pedal. Our pedal is able to do what it's supposed to do on the master cylinder. We got our reservoir bolted up as well. We also have our caliper bolted in place. Now, even though this newer caliper actually had the fittings for the bleeder and the brake hose swapped around, I was still able to get the hose on there because it's coming in from the side instead of from the front or the back or anything like that. So all this is situated, this is snug. Got a wrench on the bleeder so I could go ahead and fill up the master cylinder, get some oil down to this thing, and bleed the brakes. Leaving the bleeder valve open on the caliper is allowing the brake oil to gravity feed from our reservoir into the master cylinder and down the brake line, going to the back to go into the caliper. So had a bunch of little air bubbles pop out. Go ahead and put a little more oil in here, top this thing off, and we're gonna see if we got any oil coming out of the back yet. Give me a minute. Well, oil is gravity feeding and bleeding out by itself from our caliper, so we might not have to do anything. I'm gonna snug this thing up and see if our brakes actually work. Okay, even with the gravity feeding and all, still had to try to do the traditional bleeding method of pumping and open the bleeder valve and all, because from what research says, bleeding the hydraulic brakes on these go-karts is a pain in the ass. And even after spending almost a couple hours going back and forth between the master cylinder and the caliper and the hose and bleeding and doing all kinds of crazy crap, brakes still ain't quite perfect, but they sort of grab. So the only other option is to try this piece of shit out and see if it could be safely driven without anybody running into a tree. So, well, that's pretty much what we're gonna do. And for all intents and purposes, we got our test subject that's going to actually test drive this thing, because I'm not getting my fat ass on this thing. Keep it between the ditches. go-kart is back in action. The brakes did enough to at least, well, help us stop when we needed to. But along with that, the engine also did what it needed to do, because it went on up and down the road and everything. So I'm happy with it on that part. But as with anything motor related, you always feel you could get a little more out of it. So more than likely, we're going to see even more of this thing, because I might start researching some of the performance mods for these 196 / Predator / Honda engines, because they're all about the same thing. And we'll probably start modding this thing a little bit so we can get a little more juice out of it. And as usual, like, subscribe, notifications, TikTok, all that good stuff. And stay tuned for more go-kart action, because, yeah, this thing's pretty fun. There's going to be more go-kart action. So, I'll catch you later. It's getting late. I'm out.